Hello, and welcome to the San Francisco Opera Guild's opera preview of Giacomo Puccini's timeless Madame Butterfly. We're thrilled about this performance as its music director, Unsung Kim, conducts a new staging of Puccini's heartbreaking drama from director Amin Miyamoto. This one is a different interpretation that we're excited to see as it's told through the lens of Cho-Cho-san's son, Trouble, and the son of Cha-Cha-san and Lieutenant Pinkerton. And it provides a new perspective on an age-old story where we welcome back to the stage a couple familiar faces like Lucas Meacham and Michael Fabiano, but also some new faces, or familiar faces as Lucas Meacham and Michael Fabiano, but we welcome to the stage for her company debut, Kara Song. And we also, for the second time, Hyuna Kim and Charles Quimpo. My name is Benjamin Osgood, and I serve on the board of directors for the San Francisco Opera Guild, whose award-winning education programs reach over 64,000 students annually in more than 215 schools. Tonight, we are so excited to welcome as this evening's speaker, Alexandra Amati. She grew up in Naples, Italy, studied at the University of Pisa, studying Slavic studies and philology, the Conservatory of Music of Lucca, studying piano and composition, Harvard University, and has a PhD in musicology. Her scholarly interests include the Italian Renaissance, the Italian opera, feminist criticism, and more. She is a professor emerita at the University of San Francisco and is currently on sabbatical at Harvard University. Well, she'll be teaching there next year. She is a lecturer for many Bay Area organizations, including the San Francisco Symphony, the San Francisco Opera, the San Francisco Bach Choir, the Philharmonia Baroque, and others. She served as the president of the Harvard Club of San Francisco, on the Harvard Alumni Board, and has served on the San Francisco Bach Choir's board and as its president. She is an alto profundo. Some fun facts about Alexandra that you might not know is that she is an avid Cuban salsa dancer and dances several times per week. She just relocated to Cambridge, Massachusetts. I hope she's ready for her first New England winter. Her and her lovely cat named Nox, which means night in Latin. And if you have extra time, ask her about her huge puzzle collection. And without any further delay, I'd like to welcome tonight Alexandra for tonight's preview of Madame Butterfly. Welcome, Alexandra.
Hello, everybody. I can't see your faces, but I'm sure there are some friends in the audience, and I'm very excited to be chatting with you about Madame Butterfly, and we will talk about several topics. My cat can make an appearance.
I was hoping for a cameo of Knox.
Yes, she will. She's trying to get into the strings. So we'll talk, the way I'm going to structure this is I'm first going to tell you a little bit about 19th century Italian opera and how it places itself historically and artistically. Then we'll talk a little bit about Puccini and his style. We'll talk about exoticism, which of course is a phenomenon that is quite evident in this opera. I don't know that with all the wokeism today, something like this could be composed, but anyway, it was, and it's a great work. And then I'll tell you a little bit about geisha culture as well. And once we've done all of that, and I'm done talking, I will play a few clips from a Met production to illustrate the points that I have made. And then
Excellent.
Again, we'll have questions.
Thank you. Before I hand it off, I'll get out of your way, and I just want to let everyone know and let the audience know that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you come up with questions during Alexandra's preview, please put them in the Q&A button. But at the end, we're going to turn on the camera and for the audience, and you'll have another opportunity to interact. So without further ado, thank you again, and I will hand it over to you.
All right. I will share my screen so that you can actually see my PowerPoint presentation, and I look forward to your questions already. All right, let's go to my presentation. Hopefully someone let me know if there's any glitch, if you're not seeing the PowerPoint as you should. Hopefully you are. So we're going to talk about Madama Butterfly. The music was written by, as you all know, Giacomo Puccini, and the libretto was actually written by two men, Illica and Giacosa. It's quite unusual that a libretto be written by multiple people, but the two had actually skills that complemented each other. One was more of a poet, and the other one was more of a dramatist. So they often worked in tandem. So in the 19th century, Italian opera was 19th century, just to give you an idea, is it begins with, well, the end of the 18th century. And the beginning of the 19th century is the transition with Rossini, Donizetti, and Bellini. And then the 19th century is when we get first to Verdi, who dominates the entire century. And then at the end, we have the Verismo, and I'll tell you what that is in a minute. So the special quality about Italian opera is that it's an art form that's very deeply rooted in national life. It reflects values and thoughts of Italy at the time. Italy didn't exist, of course, at the beginning of the 19th century. It was a peninsula, but it wasn't a country. And so there's a lot of turmoil towards the creation of the Italian state, which isn't created until 1861. And so that is, of course, reflected in the artwork of the country. Across the Alps, there was the other great giant of 19th century opera, Wagner, but Wagner and Verdi, who are exact contemporaries, 1813, their birthday, were really yin and yang, completely different. And as much as Italian opera was rooted in national life, Wagner's opera was very Germanic, and thus Italians really cared very little for Wagner and his type of music. German opera is much more, it's really the opposite than Italian opera, if there can be an opposite. Italian opera is really about people, about real situations. Things could be happening on the street. Whereas German opera had always had an element of supernatural, and it was more based on legends and ancient stories. So it's a very, very different animal, so to speak. And it is relevant because Puccini belongs to this current called Verismo, which in part was born as a reaction against Wagner's nationalism, even though it postdates really, because Wagner dies in 1883. Verismo is, in Italian, there are two words that in English would be translated as realism. One is realismo, and the other one is verismo. The root of verismo is veritas, truth. And verismo in particular is the name that's given to a phase of naturalism in both literature and music that often includes projections on stage of passions that are really strong, violence, death. It really is an Italian and French phenomenon. And it is at the end of the period of the 19th century. So the idea of verismo operas is that of expressing intense passions. So for example, not love, but love. So really intense passions. And by using violent contrast, so very deep violence, very deep poverty and riches and opposites, it arouses sensations and emotional responses in the audience. It also presents a cross-section of life, whereas opera in general had not, well, there was a lot of people who were kind of like, for example, women sick with tuberculosis, etc. But the very poor strata, for example, of the population had never really been on stage. And Verismo operas really present the total cross-section of life. And there aren't the nobles because they don't exist anymore. It's very realistic. Musically, Italian opera of the end of 19th century, Verismo opera, uses harmonies that are very stark oftentimes and that are designed to provoke harmonies. And it's also, the other characteristic is that the music and the text are very concentrated, so very strong. So oftentimes the first operas of the Verismo were so concentrated that they were mostly one single act each. yeah, I'm not going to open another parenthesis. So the first operas that really start this movement of verismo are the Mascagni's opera Cavalleria Rusticana of 1890 and Ruggero Leoncavallo's I Pagliacci, the Clowns, of 2 years later. They're often presented as a pair. So in an evening, you'll get both. And the reason they're one act is, first of all, because they're very concentrated, but also there's a unity of intent and passion within a small concentrated package like that. Puccini also wrote 3 operas of this kind, which are known as il trittico, which means the triptych, because there are 3 operas, 3 one-act operas. We'll see what those are in a minute, because I have a slide with Puccini's operas. So in the 19th century, there's another movement that is relevant to our opera, and that is the movement of exoticism, with its ensemble subgroup of Orientalism, which is one particular type of exoticism. So this current of exoticism present in literature, in painting, you think of all those paintings about, like the Rousseau paintings of the Tahiti, and all these paintings about these, foreign lands, where all that was spurred by the great travels of the 19th century or end of the 18th century, and particularly by the great exhibition that took place at the Crystal Palace in London, which was fostered by the Queen and the King, and that really was a display of imperialism. If you look them up, you'll see that the exoticism really takes the form of imperialism, where you see, for example, in the trying to present, for example, African people, you have these postcards and posters that show proper British gentlemen and ladies seated at the table with these African people with bones in their hair, and the very stereotypical imperialistic image of people that they didn't know. Orientalism is one particular part of exoticism, and it involves what is called the Orient, that is particularly China and Japan. I think that the best explanation of what Orientalism is with the 1978 quote by historian Edward Said, who says that Orientalism is a pervasive Western tradition, both academic and artistic, of prejudiced outsider interpretations of the East, shaped by the attitudes of European imperialism in the 18th and 19th century. So it is an outsider view. So they didn't know what was going on. They just thought they did. They took these travelers, for example, went to these faraway places. They took a snapshot because they saw one place in one particular time. And from there, they extrapolated story of the people. Like, for example, the Tahiti example I gave before, they saw people essentially naked on the beach because that's where they lived. And they pictured this idyllic society that lived on vacation the whole day. Well, they were naked because it was hot, and they lived on the beach, and that's why they were on the beach. They were not vacation, but it is this prejudiced outsider interpretation. So keep that in mind, because that's really what Butterfly is about. So in music, this exoticism, besides the plot, manifests itself musically by using different scales and intervals. So, for example, the pentatonic scale or the whole tone scale, which are non-Western scales. So if I can give you an example, sorry, I'm leaving. A Western scale could be major or minor. For example, major is, we all know that scale, but pentatonic scale sounds like this. Very exotic with these intervals that are bigger than one tone. The whole tone scale, which is another one that came to Paris at that time, sounds like this. They sound odd to us because they're not part of the Western tradition that we grew up with doesn't make them any better or worse. They're just unusual for us. There's also the use of special instruments, instruments that like gongs and chimes and various other particularly percussion instruments. Those of you who may have seen Bone Setter's Daughter at the San Francisco Opera years ago, there were also instruments brought from China, the suena, for example. The other way in which this manifests itself in music is quoting melodies. And in Butterfly, you will hear some melodies that are Japanese melodies, and we'll get to that in a minute. So examples from the repertoire of Puccini involve that are based on exoticism, are Butterfly, of course, with Japan, La Fanciulla del West, which is California, which of course it's an exotic land for Italians, and Turandot, which is based in China. So Puccini composed very few operas in his long life, relatively long life. The first opera, which I've never seen performed, is Le Villi from 1882. I've never also seen Edgar from 1889. And then they're all hits. There's Manon Lescaut, La Bohème, Tosca, Butterfly, The Golden Girl, The Girl of the Golden West, I think it's how it's translated in English usually. La Rondine is performed less often. Then there's the triptych, which is performed quite often, like 3 one-act operas, Il Tabarro, Suor Angelica, and Gianni Schicchi. And then there's Turandot, which he left unfinished. I will not give you a biography because that's what Wikipedia is there for. But I chose these 3 images for, well, first of all, one is the iconic one of his portrait. Another one, he's sitting with his friend Toscanini, the great conductor who premiered a lot of his operas. And the last one is on a car. He loved cigarettes or any kind of smoke, actually, and fast cars. Of course, fast cars in the 1900s was a very different idea, but you see that forget about safety belts and you're in the open. In fact, he had a pretty serious car accident, though he ended up dying of throat cancer from his smoking. Let's talk a little bit about Puccini's musical style. Like most Italian music, at least up until everything went Ori in the 20th century, is really melody driven. What does that mean? It means that, of course, all music, or at least all Western music, has both melody and harmony. Italian music tends to favor the horizontal aspect of music, that is the melodic, versus, for example, Wagner or German music, Beethoven, etc., where the vertical aspect, the harmonic aspect, is much more important than in Italian music. It's much more highlighted. Italian music tends to be more melody driven, and so is Puccini's. His music has a very popular appeal. So even though it was avant-garde, the melodies had this kind of popular appeal. People hum them on the street, and typically, actually, barbers would sing them to their clients. Come on. One characteristic of Verismo, but Puccini in particular, is a style of declamation that is called parlando. Parlando is the Italian word for speaking. It translates literally to speaking. And that is a way, so there are more melodic and less melodic moments, but the dialogue, and also sometimes not dialogue, but just one character expressing their opinions, is oftentimes sung in a declamatory musical style that tries to mimic the spoken word. So it's very declamatory, very little melodic, not very melodic. Even though Italians hated Wagner or did not care for Wagner, Puccini and other musicians take from him his perhaps the principal innovation that he brought to music, and that is the use of leitmotifs, sometimes translated into significant motive. We are all familiar with those if you think about movies. In movies, oftentimes there's, for example, the Shire motive, or the in Jaws, there's the shark motive. They're little melodic snippets that are attached to a person, an object, an animal, a feeling, and they're a way for the orchestra to tell the story, to add to the story. And those are called leitmotifs. And Verdi didn't really have leitmotifs. He has a couple of recurring motives, but they're not leitmotifs. Whereas Wagner based all of his operas on leitmotifs, with the orchestra telling part of the story via these leitmotifs. How on earth you were supposed to remember what they were, that's for another lecture. But anyway, they're there and they tell the story. And Puccini uses them too, the same way as movies do. Now, if you're familiar with Mozart operas or Verdi operas, you know, or earlier operas, Rossini, you know that they come in what are called numbers or close numbers. That is, there will be, for example, a dialogue or recitative, then there'll be an aria or a chorus, and then there's a pause. And oftentimes people clap in the audience, and then it restarts. Those are called numbers. And they close and then they restart. So the aria will end and there'll be a cadence, and then something else restart. In Wagner, that disappears, and Puccini does the same, and late Verdi does the same as well. They don't break the flow anymore, the musical flow. It's a continuous fabric of music, which alternates between conversational and lyrical portions. What Puccini was great at was manipulating orchestral color. He had a very rich orchestration, and he used the orchestra, the instruments of the orchestra, to give particular color to his scenes, to add to the meaning. Verdi did that too. I have to explain this. So a critic said that, talking about Verdi's late operas, that his melodies would work up to a climax, to a state of pregnancy, as in pregnant of meaning, and then would calm down. And it would be this arch-like movement to a pregnancy, and then to being pregnant with meaning, and then calming down. In that context, Puccini's lines have been called as having a perpetual pregnancies. They're very, very emotionally heightened all the time. So it's very, very dense. Another characteristic of Puccini is that of insisting on precision in the most minute details. So for example, in Tosca, there is a Te Deum at the end of the first act, which was the melody that was typically sung upon military victory. And so he researched which version of that melody would have been sung on that day in Rome, so that it was the exact melody. Or he wanted the exact pitch of the bells for St. Peter's for the third act of Tosca. Or in Madame Butterfly, he actually researched Japanese melodies with the help of the wife of the ambassador in Rome. He had never been to Japan, but he got his hands on melodies that he could then use. So let's talk about Madame Butterfly. Madame Butterfly is called a tragedia giapponese, which means a Japanese tragedy. It was originally in 2 acts on the libretto by these 2 men that I mentioned before. Now, the libretto is based on a 1-act play by David Belasco called Madame Butterfly, that Puccini actually happened to see in London in the theater in 1900, which itself was based on a short story by John Luther Long of 1895, Miss Cherry Blossom of Tokyo, which in turn was based on Pierre Loti's, a Frenchman's tale, Madame Chrysanthème, which was partly autobiographical. And on this photo down here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this is Loti himself. And this is the woman who played the first Madame Chrysanthème. And not the actress, but it was the woman that on whom Madame Chrysanthème is based. And this was another Frenchman who was on the same naval expedition that Loti was. So that's the genealogy of the story. Now, Belasco's play had the tragic ending that we all know, but in Long's story, that is, if you go back twice, excuse me, Butterfly's suicide is interrupted, so she doesn't actually kill herself. The opera opened in Milan at La Scala, but it was a disaster in 1904. And it was withdrawn. Then he revised it. He divided the second act into two parts, and it was presented in May, so just a couple of months later, and it was a triumph. In part, the disaster at the opening night was probably because there just wasn't enough time for rehearsal. And so it must have gone astray multiple times. So who are the characters? There is Cho-Cho-san, who is Japanese, and she goes by Madama Butterfly, who's a soprano, and her maid or confidant, who's a mezzo, like always, Suzuki. Then there is the Navy lieutenant, the tenor, Pinkerton, and of course he's the tenor, so the soprano must fall in love with him. And then there are two kind of secondary characters, Sharpless, who is the US consul in Nagasaki, who procures the wife, together with Goro, who's a matchmaker. And then there are a number of other secondary characters. So let's read the synopsis. Keep in mind, however, that this is the story that you find in the score, and that you will hear, however, or see. However, the staging, as Benjamin mentioned, is somewhat different, the way that the Semsk Opera has reimagined it, as it is told through the eyes of the son, who is now a middle-aged man, and kind of finds his story. So the story happens in Japan in the early 20th century. On a flowering terrace above Nagasaki Harbor, U.S. Navy Lieutenant B.F. Pinkerton inspects the house he has leased from a marriage broker, Goro, who has just procured him 3 servants and a 15-year-old geisha wife, Cho-Cho-san, known as Madama Butterfly. Pinkerton describes his carefree philosophy to the American consul, Sharpless. He is enchanted with the fragile Cho-Cho-san, but he says he will one day have a real American wife. Cho-Cho-san arrives with friends and tells Pinkerton how she had to earn her living as a geisha when her family fell on hard times. She shows Pinkerton her few earthly treasures, and we will see that scene because it tells us a lot about her. The wedding celebration is interrupted by Cho-Cho-san's uncle, a Buddhist priest, who curses the girl for having renounced her ancestors' religion. Pinkerton angrily sends the guests away. Alone with Cho-Cho-san in the moonlit garden, he dries her tears, and she joins him in singing of their love, and that's the famous love duet. Act 2. 3 years later, Cho-Cho-san awaits, she's alone, and she's been abandoned, and she awaits her husband's return, her eyes fixed on the harbor. When the maid Suzuki shows her how little money is left, Cho-Cho-san urges her to have faith. One fine day, Pinkerton's ship will appear on the horizon. Another aria we will listen to. Sharpless brings a letter from the lieutenant and suggests Pinkerton may not return. Cho-Cho-san refuses to believe it, and she proudly shows her child, Dolore, sorrow or trouble in English, saying that as soon as Pinkerton knows he has a son, he will surely come back. If he does not, she would rather die than return to her former life. I should open a parenthesis and say that in Act 1, we find out that Cho-Cho-san's father had been sent a dagger by the emperor, which was the equivalent to the order to commit harakiri, and he had done so. Moved by her devotion, Sharpless leaves without having revealed the full content of the letter. Cho-Cho-san, on the point of despair, hears a cannon and sees Pinkerton's ship entering the harbor. Now delirious with joy, she orders Suzuki to help her fill the house with flowers. We will hear that too. As night falls, Cho-Cho-san, Suzuki, and the child begin their vigil. And there's the famous humming chorus. Act 3 or Act 2, Part 2, depending how theaters decide to do it. As dawn breaks, Suzuki insists that Cho-Cho-san rest. She's been up the whole night. Humming a lullaby to her child, she carries him to another room. Sharpless enters with Pinkerton, followed by Kate, his new wife. When Suzuki realizes who the American woman is, she collapses in despair, but agrees to help breaking the news to her mistress. Pinkerton, seized with remorse, bids an anguished farewell to the scene of his former happiness. We will hear that too, and then rushes away. He's a coward, basically. When Cho-Cho-san comes and finds Kate, she guesses the truth. Shattered, she agrees to give up her child. Then, sending even Suzuki away, she takes out the dagger with which her father had committed suicide, choosing to die with honor. Suzuki pushes the child into the room. Sobbing farewell, Cho-Cho-san sends him to play, then stabs herself. As she dies, Pinkerton is heard calling her name. Like always, he's sorry, but he's too late. Let's talk about geisha culture. These are pictures of contemporary geishas, and this one in the back is to show you that they have these very elaborate hairdos. It takes, I read somewhere around 6 hours for that to be done. And then the geisha, sorry, I have terrible jet lag. And then the geisha has to sleep with her head on a kind of platform made of wood against her neck for a week or whatever. And these colors on the neck are also typical of geishas. And this is a photo I took in Kyoto. And this is a geisha performing. So geisha culture. Geishas are actually entertainers, not prostitutes, despite what people say in movies. Most of them are female, but you would be surprised to know, perhaps, that not all of them are. There are male geishas. They basically hone their skills in 3 fields: conversation, music, and dance. And that's, they're hired on tea ceremonies and they entertain the guests. So they perform as dancers, they play classical Japanese instruments, particularly the shamisen and the shakuhachi, and they're skilled conversationalists, and they perform typically at tea ceremonies. They are trained in some very expensive and very special schools, and they start their training as very young girls. It used to be that they would go live in these boarding places, geisha houses called okiya, but in 1950, because of labor laws that forbade child labor, that was no longer the case. And it tends to run in families, that is, geishas, children, daughters tend to become geishas because they've grown up with that. And it's kind of, the family story of all families. When they're in training, they're called maiko, and they go to school, but then they also shadow their mentors, the big sister, around to see what they do in their engagements. And a maiko and geishas are dressed differently. The necks are painted differently, and the hairdos are different, marking them as trainees. And the makeup as well indicates the level of training, and how elaborate the dress is, how many layers they have. I've always been, if you watch videos where you see how the geishas are dressed, they have so many layers. It takes them forever to get dressed. And I don't even know how they walk with those pounds and pounds of fabric on them. So what about exotic music? I gave you an idea earlier. Let's go more in detail, in particular with Puccini. So he uses Japanese melodies, which he probably learned from a collection that he got, that he ordered from Japan of 1891-92, and most likely also from a collection, a piano collection that was arranged. But he also had help by the wife of the Japanese ambassador, Mrs. Oyama. And he, of course, being Puccini, studied very carefully all the elements of Japanese culture, costumes, music, etc. And he also had the help of a very famous Japanese actress that happened to be in Italy, Sadayako. I'm probably mispronouncing it, but he uses particular instruments to give this oriental color, but not many that he could get his hands on. So we have bells, which are not typically in a Western orchestra, the Japanese tam-tam, cymbals, chimes, and triangle, which were not typically part of the Western orchestra. I told you before that he uses non-Western scales. For example, the famous Sakura, which appears many times in the opera. Sakura, ta da da, ta da 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 da, pom 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 pom. That uses the pentatonic scale. Another song that appears quite often is Ha Uta, and I'll play the examples where you can hear those. He also characterizes the situations with the appropriate music. For example, at the wedding, you hear the Japanese anthem. When Pinkerton appears, he sings on the Star-Spangled Banner, which was not the national anthem at that time, but it was the Navy anthem. And maybe you didn't know that. That's a trivia thing for you. And keep in mind that for us, well, now we are in a different time. We know kind of how to respect other cultures, which this opera does not. But what I wanted to point out to you is that Pinkerton is also exotic for Italians. This is an opera for the Italian stage, and the US were, before planes, were pretty much as far as Japan. They didn't know much about US culture. So for Italians, it's not the meeting of our culture with an exotic culture, but the meeting between two exotic cultures. So think of Pinkerton as an exotic character. So now I am going to play quite a few. I have a very ambitious set of excerpts that I want to play for you, illuminating some of the points that I made. Since I'm going to go out of the slide, we are going to listen to Dovunque al Mondo, which is from Act 1, where Pinkerton explains his philosophy, and it includes the Star-Spangled Banner. Then there is Vieni Amor Mio, where he meets Cho-Cho-san, which features the Japanese songs Ha Uta and Sakura, as well as a motive, which is the fate motive, which recurs several times in the opera whenever something fateful is about to happen, especially as concerns Cho-Cho-san. Then the famous love duet, Viene la sera. Then there's the aria that Butterfly sings about hoping that he will return. Un bel dì vedremo levarsi un fil di fumo, which means one beautiful day we will see a stack of smoke coming. Then there's the duet between Butterfly and Suzuki, Scuoti quella fronda di ciliegio, which is when she sees the ship and she tells Suzuki to put cherry blossoms all over around the house. And then there's a humming chorus, which is the chorus sings with the mouth closed during Butterfly's vigil. And then there is the parting romanza that Pinkerton sings before he chickens out, saying goodbye to the house. If we have time, there are a couple more moments I'd like to play. For example, Vogliatemi bene, which is the aria at the beginning that Butterfly sings when she says to Pinkerton, love me. You can just love me a little bit, a little love that will be enough. And we'll see. I think that's already very ambitious. Let me stop sharing the screen. The performance that I'm going to use is, I have a DVD, I have various DVDs of beautiful performances, but Zoom doesn't allow the use of DVDs, believe it or not. It grays out the image. You can hear only the sound. And so I am using a performance that's on the Met On Demand website, and it's a 2009 performance, which features Patrick Summers conducting, and Patricia Rosset is doing Cho-Cho-san role, and Marcello Giordani is Pinkerton. So let us go to, I'm going to share my screen with, where did Chrome go? Oh, it's down here. Okay, and I'm going to go full screen. If you cannot see it, someone unmute themselves and tell me. And we are going to start with the Dovunque al Mondo, which is Pinkerton introducing himself and his philosophy. You will hear the Star Spangled Banner right away. What? I apologize. I don't know why it's making me log in again. It was fine half an hour ago. Apologies. I'm going to, here we go. Full screen again. Here we go.
Dovunque al mondo lo Yankee vagabondo si gode, traffica, sprezzando i rischi.
That's sharpness.
Affonda ancora all'avventura. Nel pancio whisky.
Rapid, and then it goes back to the movie.
Affonda ancora all'avventura finché una raffica scolpina mi ormeggi al velatura. La vita non appaga se non fa suo tesoro i fiori d'ogni plaga e non facile Vangelo d'ogni bella gli amor e un facile Vangelo che fa la vita vaga ma che intristisce il cuore. Vinto si tuffa, la sorte raggiuffa e il suo talento fa in ogni dove. Così mi sposo all'uso giapponese per 999
Watch out, what he's gonna say?
Salvo a prosciogliermi ogni mese. È un facile Vangelo. America ed è bella la sposa, una ghirlanda di fiori freschi, una stella
That's Goro.
e raggi d'oro, e per nulla sorgento e ien, se vostra grazia mi comanda che non assortimento. Ah, conduci la Goro!
This is the parlando style coming up.
Quali smani vi prende, saresti addirittura conto? Non so, dipende dal grado di cottura. Amore o grillo dire non saprei, certo costei, ma con l'ingenue arte invescato, lieve qual tenue vetro soffiato.
Sorry, otherwise we're watching the entire opera, and then, you know, he explains that he will someday get a real American wife. I am going to skip ahead a bit. She will be introduced, and there will be some Japanese melodies heard here and there. And I'm going to go ahead to the moment where they are formally introduced, and he says, "Come, my love." Yes, number 8.
Vieni, amor mio.
What is the harp, which is the instrument of maidens,
Ti
essentially?
piace la casetta?
Signor B.F. Pinkerton, perdono.
This is Auta. This is a Japanese song.
Piacetti da donna,
Dove sono?
qui, vi dispiace.
Oh, perché mai la bella paterfilla?
And now, this is still Auta.
Fazzoletti,
And here comes
la
Sakura.
pipa, una cintura,
Bum, bum,
un
bum,
piccolo
bum,
ferro,
bum.
uno
Yes, Sakura.
specchio, un ventaglio,
Quel barattolo.
vaso di tintura.
Oibò.
Vi spiace? Via!
E quello.
Cosa sacra è mia?
E non si può vedere.
Silence in the music. That's the faith motive.
La gente,
That's the faith motive.
perdonate.
In presente del mikado a suo padre, con l'invito, e suo padre ha obbedito.
Back to Butterfly with the Japanese melody.
Quei pupazzi avete detto.
Son l'anime degli
Ah, il mio rispetto.
Ieri son salita tutta sola e segreto alla missione con la nuova mia
Now this is how the music sounds religious, very soft.
posso adottare nuova religione. Lo zio Bonzo non lo sa, né i miei lo sanno. Io seguo, io ne seguo.
Sorry about the abrupt interruption, but you have seen in the scene, we have seen quite a few things. First of all, what I told you about creating atmosphere with musical means. You had the Star Spangled Banner for Pinkerton. We had the two Japanese melodies for Chocho-san, Hauta and Sakura, which I pointed out. And then we also heard the fate motive when the dagger came out and she was scared that he would disrespect it as well as not understand what it really was. And she demanded it back. So now we're going to go to Viene la Sera, which is the moment of actually, no, before I go, I'm going to change my mind. I am going to go, I want to make sure that I hit the main points. I am going to go to the moment when she asks him to love her, even just a little love. And that is the track number 14. Very high strings, creating this atmosphere. That's her being very lyrical and very Western. I'm going to go back a little bit and go to their love duet, which is the beginning. There's no break between the scenes. So this is Viene la Sera, the evening is coming, and it's their love duet at the end of Act 1.
Sei qui sola,
sola e rinnegata,
a voi chiudete.
Sì, sì, noi tutti sovi.
How declamatory it is.
Il mondo.
E il panzo furibondo
Suggiuti le mie vesti.
very atmospheric, creating the night idea. The night. All the instruments playing the same thing. With the oboe at the top and the flute.
Questo vi composo di sciogliervi tarda.
Noti di scoiattolo in odia in te scioglie, e in sale per quel giocattolo mia moglie, ma tal grazia mi spiega.
Canto rosso.
Io mi stronco per la febbre d'un subito desio.
Sorry if I interrupted, but I can't speak loud enough. Notice how it is a duet, but it isn't a duet. They're singing about different things. She is singing about her situation. He's just saying, oh, I've got a wife. All right, we're going to go ahead now to a different track. And I'm just enticing you. Hopefully you will go, but otherwise you will watch it. We are going to go to Un bel dì vedremo, which is the part where at the beginning of Act 2, essentially Ciccio-san is chastising Suzuki for really being realistic. He's coming back. I am going to play the beginning of this again because just a few seconds, I want you to have the melody in your mind. Okay. The reason I want you to have that melody da, 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 in your mind is because later, when which is where we're going to go now, when the ship actually arrives, there is a cannon, the sound of a cannon on stage, actually, usually. And then Suzuki says, "Oh, the cannon from the harbor," and then starts the part where she says she sees the ship, and she says, it's a white ship. Wait, give me the binoculars. Let me read the name, and it quotes Un bel dì vedremo. So it harks back to the beginning of Act 2 at the end of Act 3, or the middle of Act 3, when it actually comes true that he comes, that he arrives. And then she says, put the cherry blossoms, and that is 25. Let's see. Read the quote.
Una nave da guerra bianca il vessillo americano delle stelle rigoverna per angolare reggimi la mano che a me discerna il nome
Saying, hold my hand because it's trembling. Star Spangled Banner. And then, of course, it's the whole night that they have to wait because that's how the story goes. I'm afraid of that clock. So a couple more excerpts. The humming chorus has become iconic. Every chorus likes to perform it. It's taken out of context, unfortunately, in so many concerts. The point of the humming chorus is that there is this very long wait. She is there waiting for Pinkerton to arrive. She actually stands vigil the whole night she makes 3 holes in the wall of the paper wall of the house, one for her, one for Suzuki, one for the child, and they look out and it's night. And so the chorus is not saying any words, and it's just a way to symbolize that there is a community there. There's other people, but she's actually alone. They're not talking to her. But everybody's seeing what she is doing. I'll just play a little excerpt because then you'll recognize it, and it's track 27. Well, the staging is different. And this continues all the way to the intermission between Act 2 and Act 3, or Act 2 Part 1 and Act 2 Part 2. And then the final excerpt is when Pinkerton bids farewell to the house where he was happy.
Addio, fiori quasi di letizia ed amor, sempre il mite suo sembiante, con strazio atroce vedrò. Ma or quel cuore sincero presagio quasi si ricorda e fui profeta e guai
You notice that in this aria, like in the duet before, the love duet, they're not your traditional arias or duets. They're interrupted. There are other characters. It's a much more fluid idea of storytelling. So I hope that all these examples have kind of shown you some of the many ways in which this opera really gives a great portrayal of this very tragic story. It's very moving and it moves relatively fast. I don't know what the timings are at the opera, but it is not a short opera, and yet it is so fluid going from one thing to the next that it feels like it goes by really fast. I could talk for another 3 days about this opera. There's so much in it, but I think maybe we should open to questions because I don't know what strikes your fancy, what you want to know more about. So I will bring John Morris here, who's our magician, and he can make it so that I can see you and we can have a conversation.
Alexandra, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. And yes, we will now pivot to our Q&A. Hello, everyone. I'm John Morris, Education Program Manager with the Opera Guild. So what I'm going to do is I am going to turn all of our audience members into panelists so that you can join us for this Q&A portion. So you may see something that says accept when it says promote to panelist, and then you can join us on the virtual stage here. And Benjamin and Peggy, if you'd like to join us as well.
Hi, Benjamin.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was amazing.
Oh, I'm glad you liked it. I'm sorry about the cat meowing, but she wanted attention. Then she left. She's offended. She's probably going to give me the cold shoulder for the next month and a half.
You know, my girlfriend and I were in Japan last month, and we spent some time in Kanazawa, which has one of the last, I guess, teaching grounds for traditional geisha, and where traditional geisha lived, because many of the samurai, the wealthier samurai, would retire to the western coast of Japan. And one thing that we found so fascinating was that when you're walking around Kanazawa and even Kyoto, when we were there, and this is my third trip to Japan, there are now costume shops that you can go rent a geisha costume and dress up and walk around. And it's because these teenage and adolescent girls, and the culture still holds that profession in such a high regard. They want to be them. So you see these young girls that are not professionally trained geisha walking around and taking photos for tourists, and then you rent the costume for the day and you bring it back. So it was cool to see that. And I think our recent trip to Japan has fueled my desire to see this particular opera and to see it in a different light, through a different lens. So appreciate the perspectives that you brought to this opera.
So is it not working? Are people not joining? What's going on?
So I've sent invitations to everyone, and so they can accept those invitations to.
Or maybe I put everybody to sleep.
Well, no. So I've sent invitations to everyone, so feel free to join us on the virtual stage to our audience. I would like to ask you, Alexandra, what is your favorite Puccini opera? And my other question is, Puccini is undeniably, very popular with seasoned opera goers and new opera goers.
Yeah.
And we could say it's the soaring melodies, we could say it's the arias, we could say it's the strong themes. I'm curious, from your perspective, what makes him one of the most popular composers? So two-part question.
Yeah. Well, my favorite, that's a difficult one. I would probably have to pick Poem, just because it has so much in it. There are the most amazing melodies, the saddest melodies, the story, well, they're all tragic, but it's heart-wrenching. But yet the second act is this very joyous moment. So there are all the extremes. And it's true, of the operas that I showed you on the screen, that the very few operas that he wrote, there are some that are the theater's moneymakers. So Bohème, Tosca, they are the ones that are, and Butterfly to a certain extent, they are the moneymakers. And it is because of this very wide appeal that Puccini's operas have. I think that in part they appeal to people because of this fluidity, how it goes from lyrical moments to dialogue. Nothing is said. You don't have a duet where for 20 minutes you have to sit through two people singing to each other. There's always this dynamic acting where other people intervene. There's a chorus. There's the drink. You want a whiskey. So there is. It's much less contrived. It is also true of many Verdi operas, by the way. On the other hand, what we like of operas by Mozart, by Handel, by Haydn, by all the other composers, is that you get the 20 minutes or you get the gorgeous melody repeated over and over in very different guises. So there is a give and take. But I think that an opera that has, like a Rossini opera or a Mozart opera, especially the serious ones and Handel, they require a different type of attention because there's no fluidity. You have these enclosed, self-contained units that follow each other and tell a story, but it takes a little bit more on the part of the spectator in terms of putting this patchwork together into one picture. And then, of course, if you have an opera by Handel or some Baroque composer where there's this endless sequence of arias, da capo arias, those were not intended for you to sit. Hello, my cat wants an opinion. For you to sit through and listen. The reason the operas are structured that way is because people were playing cards and eating sausage and cheese, and oh, look, there's an aria. Okay, and you were saying the ball yesterday night. Oh, look, he's singing, and it was a much more interactive thing. If you try to sit through 3 or 4 Baroque arias, I think you end up being a murderer. You kill someone because it's really, you can't, and they're not designed to do that. So you also have to place them historically. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
Absolutely. Thank
It's
you.
like watching a baseball game or a soccer match.
soccer. I don't even know what baseball was. Is that the one that has the ball this shape? I honestly don't know. I'm ignorant. I don't know. I'm a soccer girl. I'm Italian. What do you want? Is there any question from the audience at all in the Q&A?
We haven't received any questions yet, so if anyone has a question, you could put it in the Q&A. You also could raise your hand, and we could bring you on to the screen to ask Alexandra yourself, or I'm happy to ask the question for you. In the meantime, Benjamin and Peggy, do you have any questions?
Well, I don't necessarily have a question, but I just, no matter how much you think you know about, say, this particular opera, Madame Butterfly, I learned so much more this evening, and I'm going to highly recommend it to everybody to sign on and see the recording of this, actually Italian and Puccini Madame Butterfly preview. It's been fabulous. Thank you so much. And by the way, if anybody is in the audience who's been to one of the previous previews where Alexandra spoke, she would love to see you and hear from you.
And I think that's the thing about these virtual previews is that most of our viewership comes after it's been recorded. Over the next month, people will start to tune into it, and but they're such a treasure. To Peggy's point, when you engage with these opera previews and you work with a scholar like Alexandra, and they open your eyes to things that you haven't seen before. I had never thought about the way that Puccini seamlessly blends a Western scale with a pentatonic scale, and you don't even realize it happening. And then you think about it, you're like, oh gosh, yeah, wow. He's got these very Eastern musical themes just perfectly blended into a Western scale. So
Right.
I'll notice that going into the performance when we go see it.
Right. And then there's also the orchestral color. When she appears, you have all the treble instruments, and then you have the harp and all of these celestial maiden-like instruments, and then he comes and all of a sudden the brass is coming in. It's really,
That musical language,
it's amazing.
that musical narrative.
I really
it's-
hope that people are going out. Does any of you know how the ticket sales are going?
I think pretty well. I think pretty well. And what's unique about the summer season is there's something for everyone in that there's Madame Butterfly and then Die Frau ohne Schatten, which is
Hello.
maybe a little bit lesser known, and then the new opera El Último Sueño de Frida y Diego.
Right, the Frida
So that's-
Kahlo one.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
Well, I hope people go, and if you're listening, if you're one of the people who are there, or if you're watching this another day, go see it. It's opera is not a thing that you see once, right? I've seen, I don't know how many productions of Butterfly, and I would still go to another one because it's a different singer, it's a different staging, it's a different day, it's different tempi, and they can make without changing the text. This is the opera. This is what it is. This is what you hear, and yet the way you stage it, the way you costume it, the way you block it, you can change completely the nuance of the meaning of gestures. It's in the tone, it's in the acting. So I'm sorry I don't get to see this version from Trouble's point of view. I have no idea. By the way, that puppet in the Met is scary. It's
That was
really scary.
interesting. Yeah, that was an interesting
Yeah,
interpretation.
it's really sinister because they also made the puppet hairless. It's like,
Well, and the moment when the puppet jumped into Butterfly's arms and
right.
watching how they were doing that, it was really fascinating actually.
Yeah, they are really good, but it's
Right.
still it's uncanny.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just glad it's actually a puppet, because for the first few moments, I thought it was a real child. And the first thing I thought was, why is he bald? And how come no one's feeding him?
Yes.
Oh, it
That's
looks
what
like-
I said, uncanny.
So Alexandra, a comment has come in from Pat to say, we don't have any questions per se, but we want to say how much we enjoy Alexandra's presentations every time she presents, and thank you so much. So
Thank you so much, Pat.
I'm going to share that
Thank
with
you,
you.
Pat.
Yes,
you.
thank you, Pat. And if others have questions that come up down the road, could we provide your email address?
Absolutely, please.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay, because
Yes.
sometimes I get emails with additional questions and
absolutely, 100%. Yes.
okay, wonderful.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I don't think any other questions have come in, so I will let Peggy and Benjamin wrap things up for us. I'll just mention that this is being recorded and the virtual preview will be available to stream on demand through July 1st, the run of the production. And I will put the opera preview link in the chat for all of our viewers.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us tonight. And for Madame Butterfly, I'm taking one daughter and two granddaughters, and I'm going to make them see this preview and watch it because I think it'll really help them enjoy the opera and understand the opera. And also for those people who are not able to get to the opera itself, it will be live streamed on Friday, June 9th at 7:30, but you have to sign up ahead of time. It's $27.50. And again, like John mentioned, you'll be able to tell your friends to watch this wonderful preview. It's going to be around until July 1st. And I hope to see everybody and more people, as many people as possible on Thursday. When is it? Thursday, June 8th. And we're going to have the preview for El Último Sueño de Frida y Diego with Lucy Kaplan, who also is from Cambridge and Harvard. And she will be our preview speaker. And all this week, you'll be able to go to live previews throughout the Bay Area on Monday in Marin, Tuesday, the Peninsula, San Jose on Wednesday, East Bay on Wednesdays, and again, the virtual on Thursday evening at 6 p.m. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I will now let Benjamin conclude the program tonight. And thank you so much, Alexandra. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, from everyone here at the San Francisco Opera and the San Francisco Opera Guild, we thank you, Alexandra, and we thank everyone who joined us, and we wish you a good night. We'll see you next time.